You mentioned earlier your media partners, one of which is The Guardian, with whom you're now involved in a dispute, but you chose them as your primary English language partner for distributing the WikiLeaks cables. But they appear to have drastically edited those cables, particularly in relation to how British gas companies operate abroad. And now Guardian journalists have published this book on WikiLeaks, which you say is an attack on you. How would you describe, following that, the Guardian's stance on whistleblowing and media freedom in general?
Well, they have a mixed opinion on that. You know, they are a publishing organisation, so of course they want as much right for them to publish as possible. That's a natural self-interest. What they have done with this cable cooking, in this incredible redaction, over-redaction of cables. We saw a case for Bulgarian organised crime where they redacted all the figures in Bulgarian organised crime, something very important for the Bulgarian people to know about, is they have pushed the right of the people to know at the very, very edge. And what they're concerned about is any possible attack on them by these organised crime figures, by oligarchs and politicians in Kazakhstan, etc., etc. And so they want to completely minimise any conflict by redacting the names of all those people. I mean, we even saw a case in Kazakhstan where they redacted the name of an Italian company that was purported to be corrupt. The US ambassador was writing corrupt. Redacted even that a number of members of the Kazakhstan elite was corrupt, without actually the individual names, just that fact that a number of members in the Kazakhstan elite were corrupt. But we have seen this sort of abuse of the material that we have provided several times. And the Guardian is the worst offender, but we saw it also by the New York Times. The New York Times redacted a 62-page cable down to 2 paragraphs. And this is completely against the agreement that we originally set up with them on November the 1st last year. That agreement was that the only redactions that should take place are to protect people's lives. There should be no other redaction, not to protect reputation, not to protect the Guardian's profits, but only to protect lives. And so that's a corruption of their agreement that they tried to feed this material back. But we can compare it, and so we have an ongoing research project to discover all the ways in which the New York Times and Guardian have abused that process and taken things from the public that rightfully they should know.
But why would you not then just cut out the middleman and publish the cables yourself? I mean, surely you want to have ultimate control over what goes out. Why wouldn't you just do it yourself?
We have to understand the scale of this release of information. So if we took these cables and we printed them out end to end, they would go between St. Petersburg and Moscow. It is that much material. So to actually get through it does require us to bring in the capacities of a lot of other organisations. And we've now built up a network of over 63 different media organisations from around the world, and NGOs like Amnesty, Greenpeace and Global Witness to get through this material.
So that's Julian Assange speaking 12 years ago. Quite a lot of that is about the court case, Martin, in Sweden, which eventually came to nothing, but of course he was right. The ultimate aim was just to get him to the United States. I'm just looking at we'll be talking about Vault 7 later, which was an absolutely massive release. Many have admitted that it was the CIA's most devastating release, so much in fact that it prompted then CIA Director Mike Pompeo to slam WikiLeaks as a hostile intelligence service. The guy that actually did the leaking supposedly has been prosecuted, but there was a mistrial. And he's about to be, his name is, I think, Joshua Schulte, S-C-H-U-L-T-E, and Assange is not facing charges for that. But we got I suppose, a slightly happier note. Difficult to be so happy though, isn't it, about a marriage that's taken place this week, in Belmarsh prison. It's not the greatest place. It's almost like a marriage in the dungeon. They were allowed 15 minutes and he was put back in his cell.
Well, I mean, congratulations to him on his marriage, but of course, the whole situation is absolutely disgraceful. And, we are going to war, supposedly, in the Ukraine, or perhaps not, because it's a bit scary, but for freedom and democracy. But meanwhile, Julian Assange is probably one of the highest profile political prisoners in the world, right here in this country.
A lot of talk about The Guardian there. The Guardian doing their job back in 2011, now no longer.
Well, what happened there is that the mainstream press were quite happy to go along with what WikiLeaks were giving them, and then the security services came and, crushed their testicles and twisted their arm, and they basically threw Assange, who'd basically given them loads of copy and made the careers of quite a few journalists in The Guardian, they threw him to the dogs.
Anyway, I spoke to Julian's dad, John Shipton, earlier this week, just before the marriage, and he took us through some of including the fact that is no longer going to have the right to appeal to the British Supreme Court. But he was in a fairly upbeat mood, as he usually is. An amazing guy, John, talking about his son Julian's incarceration as one of the world's most well-known political prisoners right here in London.
My name is John Shipton. I'm Julian Assange's father. I'm on a tour of the continent of Europe and the United States and Australia to build a coalition of support for Julian to bring an end to the, they call it a prosecution, the persecution of Julian, which has now entered, I think on Palm Sunday, it'll enter its 14th year.
I've just been looking at this air crash over in China yesterday, which is a China Eastern 737 that at cruise altitude, it looked like the crew was struggling with it, and then suddenly there was a power dive, which is a very strange thing for any aircraft to do. The only thing is, of course, we had two similar crashes. Now, I know in Vault 7, Julian actually published quite a lot of information about the capabilities to hack, and I just wonder, this Vault 7 does seem to be incredibly damning, John, whether this is one of the things which has really made the United States decide to shut Julian down.
It's said amongst the aficionados of Julian's case, the people who follow it very closely, that Vault 7 stimulated the CIA to persecute Julian and actually caused Mike Pompeo on the 17th of April 2017 to launch the CIA into the spying of Julian and to the suborning of the UC Global, which was the security company in charge of the Ecuadorian embassy at the time, to spy on Julian 24 hours a day. That Vault 7 is so vital to the CIA and the use of, for example, it was enabled, one of the attributes of Vault 7 enabled the CIA to hack into another institution's computer and leave evidence of a third party having done the hack. So this means that every single attribution of a cyber attack can be, or is likely to be falsified.
I think the most amazing thing was that the manuals for these hacking tools were published, and a lot of the development had been done by the secret services, mainly obviously by the signals intelligence people, and yet they were then made available to selected commercial outlets so that they could use them themselves for industrial espionage and possibly even assassination, John.
Yes, it's been a catastrophe for all round. Once these creatures escape their confines, I call them creatures, but these techniques escape their confines, they are able to be used for any purpose whatsoever by anybody, so that anybody that so understands the techniques. It's quite a disaster, really, for everybody.
Okay, what about the court case in London, though, for your son? Because I understand that he's now been refused the right to appeal to the Supreme Court, although, of course, this is a supremely important case. The Supreme Court is something that Britain brought in about 10 or 12 years ago, almost in mimicry of the United States Supreme Court. We never had something like that before. Our final court of appeal used to be the House of Lords. But anyway, what do you make of this? Is this the end of the line for the court case? How's it going to go from here, do you think?
Well, there's a couple of things, Tony, and a couple of answers to expand upon in your question. First one up is that now Julian has appeared before 21 judges, most of those judges from superior courts. So this gives you some idea of the antipathy of the judiciary to Julian Assange. There's every sort of contortion of due process. Due process requires the equal arming of either side in the defence and the prosecution. Well, in Julian's case, it simply hasn't happened. The next part of the question is that now it goes to the defence to make an appeal to the High Court on the judgment of Judge Baritza back in January last year. So that appeal will be considered by the High Court and either agreed to or declined. I imagine it'll be declined because the defence's appeal is against all aspects of Baritza's judgment excepting the health judgment. So every single aspect, for example, that the treaty obligations between the United States and the United Kingdom, that any extradition for a political purpose or a political reason can't be done. Well, in, of course, Julian's case, you could say that was a political act of the publishers of WikiLeaks. The next one is that we take into account, this is really very important, public interest. So the public interest was ruled against by Judge Baritza in the Magistrates Court. Well, this is really an important concern of the polity of the United Kingdom, that any public interest publication can be attacked by the United States or another state, and the journalist, such as yourself, can be arraigned and extradited to the complaining state. It's a catastrophe. There are, of course, quite a number of other areas to look at. For example, the Espionage Act of the United States in 1917 that was used to attack Julian, the computer intrusion charge brought about by the testimony of an Icelandic person who has since recanted their testimony and made further testimony that the FBI had promised him freedom from prosecution, immunity from prosecution, and was also a convicted fraudster and a convicted paedophile. So it's not the sort of witness that has any credibility, and yet Judge Baritza, in her unwisdom, ruled that she would accept that evidence. So there's three areas that are of a profound concern to the administration of law and justice in the United Kingdom.
Looking at the wider picture, things are very much hotting up, particularly in Eastern Europe, John, between the East and West. It's almost like a new Cold War. I wonder whether you think Julian's case fits in with this.
I don't, the publications from COVID onwards, of the mass media, COVID onwards to right now, have a homogeneity of opinion which blends entirely with the government's attitude. Now, this is not a healthy circumstance for a democracy, and not a healthy circumstance for mothers and fathers to make up, to gain knowledge, to make decisions for their children and family. In fact, it's the opposite of healthy. And you'll see that all of a sudden COVID disappeared entirely. I mean, it's in the consciousness of the nation is overtaken completely by a new concern. So there's a fundamental, universal concern, a pandemic. Everybody's very worried about the well-being of their mothers and fathers and children and themselves. Then 1 week later, it's gone completely, and everybody's subsumed. Their consciousness is subsumed in a vigor to embark upon warfare. This is not really very healthy, and we must, of course, make every effort to bring back a critical application of news, not submitting to. Well, I don't quite know how to express it, but submitting universally to whatever the government wants, because all newspapers line up behind what the government so decides to do at the time, particularly when it's war, or particularly when it's a pandemic.
Yes, that's certainly true, and we can see it here, almost like in lockstep with each other. Look, you're an Australian, Julian's Australian. I mean, how is Australia taking this? I would have thought that, that it would be kicking off against the old colonial power, doing the absolutely appalling, completely unjust treatment of one of their own.
Oh, God's sake, the acquiescence is complicity. They haven't made boot of a goose, the Australian government. However, the Australian polity, and 30 members of the Australian Parliament, I think there's 270 members in the Australian Parliament, 30 members, including the Deputy Prime Minister, are in the Assange group. They're one of the great charms of parliamentary democracy, or representative democracy, is that the parliamentarian brings into the majesty of Parliament, the sovereign majesty of Parliament, the concerns of their constituency, and insists that the executive act upon those concerns. This, of course, has declined over the years as the sovereign majesty of Parliament is the envy of many institutions. But in the case of Julian Assange, it faces renewal, because the concerns of those parliamentarians and those constituencies that the parliamentarians represent are cross-party. They have nothing to do with party affiliation, and entirely are concerned with the prosecution and oppression of citizen Julian Assange. So I think that that's a heartening circumstance in a generally bleak landscape.
Well, there's something very, very medieval about the way that Julian has been incarcerated, almost like Henry VIII throwing someone into the dungeon. How is he, John?
Not the best. This is not the best, but when you, I just use this analogy, when you throw out the compost and make mulch, you'll see occasionally a seed break through and a flower to grow in the compost, or some new fresh growth. Well, in the case of Julian Assange and Stella, his fiancé and bride-to-be tomorrow in Belmarsh. Julian will marry. Julian and Stella will marry at 2 p.m. in the confines of Belmarsh. This is a Belmarsh maximum security prison for terrorists and murderers. And within that, despite that circumstance, love has grown, and there are 2 beautiful children from that liaison. So, and that will be celebrated despite the oppression, the United Kingdom's justice system and the Crown Prosecuting Services smearing and, contortion of due process. So something new, fresh and loving will be celebrated tomorrow within the confines of a terrorist jail.
Are these decisions actually being made in London, or do you think this is something just, as many people have said, from the United States?
Tony, yeah, that's I mean, for years we've all thought that, the United Kingdom is acting proxy for the United States. But the other day I came across the Nuremberg Code, and I think it was Article 6, so I'm not sure on the article number, but it states explicitly that if you committed a crime, you can't say somebody else told me to do it and thereby be excused. The persecution of Julian Assange falls upon the shoulders, the responsibility falls squarely upon the shoulders of the United Kingdom judiciary and the Crown Prosecuting Service. Whether or not the United States is involved is not significant to the contortions of due process and the irregularities of disobeying or ignoring the conventions of asylum and dragging Julian out of the Ecuadorian embassy when he's an asylee. If I could remind your listeners that an asylee, being an asylee, is a process which you go through, lifting you above the laws of the nation that you are in, particularly in the circumstances of the United Kingdom, particularly as the United Kingdom is one of the authors and a signatory to the conventions of asylum. So we face this circumstance where the magnificent civil artifacts that came into being in the mid-20th century after the catastrophe of the Second World War, the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Conventions of Asylum, the Geneva Conventions, every single one of them abrogated in the case of Julian Assange. And that abrogation will continue unless we, for other people, it will continue for other people unless we, the members of the public and the members of constituents and parliamentarians, object. And so it's pursuant upon us to bring renewal to the administration of law in the United Kingdom and Australia.
Okay, so I understand you're coming to London. If people want to see you, John, where can they come?
Where? Well, all of us will be dressed up with our finery on for Julian and Stella's wedding outside Belmarsh, the maximum security prison tomorrow at 2:00. So the wedding is on at 2. And I guess it's only 15 minutes. They're pretty mean, these people. They only allow 15 minutes after 15 minutes. And so I guess we'll be out at 2:30.
What about campaigns in the UK particularly? Whereabouts can people find those?
DEA, don't extradite Assange.org, DEA. They're the campaign headquarters for Julian Assange. Myself and Gabrielle, Julian's brother, we go back to Australia on the 29th because we had an election in Australia and we've built up a bit of a war chest and a bit of a following, so we're going to do our utmost to cause the Australian government. It's interesting in Australia. It's strategically vital. It has every resource, food and iron ore, bauxite, gas, energy. It has every resource. It's strategically vital, but it's politically feeble. So we will attack, maybe that's the wrong word, but we will do our utmost to push Australia into the circumstance where it realises politically some of its strategic vitality and defends the citizen Julian Assange. That's our job.
John Shipton, thanks very much for joining us.
Tony, always a pleasure to speak to you. I hope to catch up to you for another delightful afternoon tea and lunch. Yeah, that'd be great.
So that's Julian Assange's father, John Shipton, speaking to me earlier this week, just the evening before his son got married to Stella Moris, Martin, in Belmarsh prison.
Yes, well, the situation is still pretty dire, isn't it? And we'll have to see what happens to him.
What he's saying there, it's there is another stage in this court case, also talking about 21 different judges. Quite clearly there's something seriously wrong with the judiciary. At the top of the whole system, actually, it's the Queen. The head of the head of state really, needs to do something about this. Otherwise, I mean, one of the most important points I suppose he's making there is it was very, very fascinating to make those various points about the problems, is the idea that the effect that this is going to have, the precedent that this is going to set. If you have a look at the various court cases that have been going on abroad. For example, this guy Joshua Schultz, who was supposed to be the guy that leaked the Vault 7 that got up Mike Pompeo's nose. Well, Julian is not going to face any charges over publishing those, that devastating Vault 7 leak, we've been told just a few months ago. And yet he's being done for espionage. Now, clearly, he is receiving information from whistleblowers. He is not doing the espionage himself, and yet he's being prosecuted as a spy.
Yes, it makes no sense at all. I mean, the Espionage Act in the United States is incredibly controversial in itself. It was brought in 1917 to smash the anti-war movement. Eugene V. Debs, who was a socialist senator, was imprisoned under it. And then in the 1960s, it was passed through the US Congress that it had extra territorial force, so that anybody in the entire world could be accused of espionage against the United States of America.
These maniac Americans trying to take over the world, and this is just them controlling the British legal system.
Well, that's right. And of course, there's all sorts of things about the Americans. They're exceptionalistan.
Well,
they're not part of the International Criminal Court. They haven't signed up to biological weapons conventions. They've ripped up all the nuclear treaties that they made with the USSR, and they just say, well, we can do what we want. And
why have we bent over for them? Why has the Queen, why has the British judiciary, why has the Labour Party, why has the Conservative Party, why has the British establishment bent over for the Yanks?
Because we are a colony of the United States of America. Not to put too fine a point on it, we are their loyalist little gopher. And that is the role of the ruling class in this country, is simply to do what the US wants. And of course that's that's how we are perceived in the rest of the world.
Not a lot of point in Brexit, really, then, was there? If we're not actually a sovereign country. I mean, we were talking last week, weren't we, about whether or not Ukraine is sovereign. Well, we're clearly not either.
Well, sovereignty is in actual fact a rather elusive concept, isn't it?
Who's in charge? Is it just the Americans? Who is it in America?
Well, look, what we're talking about is an oligarchic deep state in the United States and Britain. I mean, when Margaret Thatcher left office, she then went to live in Texas. These people, Rupert Murdoch, who runs our media, lives in the United States and was born in Australia. Now, these people are an international ruling class who've got houses everywhere. But they're not, and the role of the British government is simply to, I mean, that's how we are perceived. We are the absolutely loyal enforcers of US diktat. And, that's how we're perceived in Afghanistan, it's how we're perceived in Iraq, it's how we're perceived in France and Germany. And, that's the ruling class here sees themselves in that role. Whether the ordinary people do is another matter. But of course, the culture is saturated with, because of the language, with American thinking. And, that is the way in which this country runs.
Isn't it shocking? I think for me, which is most shocking, was to see the just complete lack of reporting it of the wedding on the news, on radio or television. This is actually a large part of what Julian Assange was doing as a publisher, was showing up this media that now has turned their back on him.
Well, exactly. I mean, the reason they're not reporting is because it's an embarrassment. You do occasionally see a sort of shamefaced article in The Guardian saying this is all a bit out of order, but they're not making a big deal out of it, even though they are primarily responsible for getting him incarcerated. And, of course, in the yellow press, the Murdoch press, I mean, Julian Assange is a non-person. And, as I say, we are not going to go to war in Ukraine because it's actually too dangerous, but we claim to be defending freedom and democracy. But in actual fact, that's just a hollow lie, isn't it?
Well, Stella Moris said this week that journalists were barred from the wedding in order to dehumanise her husband.
Yes, well, I mean, they just basically trying to control the narrative. It's probably become quite embarrassing that he's still in Belmarsh. It's extraordinary, really. He's a non-violent prisoner, and he's been incarcerated in the most high-security prison in the country for years. I mean, it just beggars belief. And, of course, what it is it's in plain sight what's happening. And if this was happening in Nazi Germany, I'm quite sure people like Tim Kent would be up in arms about it as a Liberal Democrat councillor, but we just ignore it because it's just like the shrug of the shoulders in this country, isn't it now?
The Guardian has actually done quite a good job reporting the shenanigans going on between Julian's family and Stella's family and the prison authorities in Belmarsh. She says behind the scenes the couple have been locked in a dispute with the Ministry of Justice and the prison authorities, who says they've denied their proposed witnesses because they are journalists. A proposed photographer has also been denied because he also works for the press, even though they would all attend in private capacities. The prison states that our wedding picture is a security risk. It could end up in social media or in the press.
Well, I mean, it just shows how fundamentally authoritarian these people are. And I can't understand why barristers like Sir Keir Starmer aren't up in arms about this. This is an absolute disgrace to English common law.
Well,
where is Lady, whatever her name was, that stopped the prorogation of Parliament? Well, she'd be speaking up about this, surely.
No, she's not interested. Anyway, Stella also adds that the far-right activist Tommy Robinson and other convicted prisoners were allowed to be interviewed on camera by ITV inside Belmarsh, but no, even a still photographer for Julian.
Well, we all know what side these people are on, don't we?
That's MI5, isn't it, doing that? Actually, that's the security services saying that because Tommy Robinson is one of our little nutter magnets, that we can get loads of publicity for him, ITV filming him in there. But Julian has got to be, basically, as a non-person.
Well, that's right. And that
she points out as well, he's not even serving a sentence.
No, indeed. And he's being extradited for something that isn't illegal in Britain, and he's not even a British citizen. Well, I mean, the thing about these high-profile cases like this is that, well, it's only one individual, but it's a straw in the wind of which direction the deep state wants to take us in. And step by step, if you don't speak up, what's it Pastor Niemöller said? They came for the communists. I wasn't a communist, so I said nothing. And this is the salami tactics that the deep state will use to put us all in the slammer if they get their way.
Well, the idea, it seems to me, is to shoot in the head the greatest journalist of the 21st century and to send a very clear message.
The Americans openly discussed assassinating him.
Yeah, and also, of course, to completely disappear him. Untermensch. I'm convinced, she says, Stella, that the authorities fear people will see Julian as a human being, not a name, but a person. Their fear reveals that they want Julian to remain invisible to the public at all costs, even on his wedding day, and especially on his wedding day, for him to disappear from public consciousness. Isn't that? I mean, the idea
that's pretty accurate.
We're going to
isn't
forget about Julian. We're being told this guy, forget about him.
Yes. And we're also having the massive war drums beaten in our ears day in, day out on the mainstream media. And the last thing they want is somebody like Julian Assange who exposed the war crimes of the British and US. And of course people should be convicted of war crimes. If Putin is a war criminal, which is debatable, then surely Brigadier Gordon Kerr, who organised the loyalist death squads in Northern Ireland, is a war criminal. And maybe the people who invaded Iraq with no legal justification. Maybe they are war criminals. They killed over 1 million people. Surely they should stand trial. We could put them on trial with Putin. We could have a grand trial of everybody who's a war criminal. But that ain't going to happen, is it?
Well, thanks to Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers, also Lib Dem councillor for Hengrove and Whitchurch Park, Tim Kent. My book on the Fourth Reich, that is 30 years of research into the origins of the Bilderbergers and the Nazis, deals with the Allies back to the World War II Battle of Arnhem, is out in paperback, priced £15 including postage. Also, my anthology on secret government, from Cromwell to the assassination of Princess Diana, The Siege of Heaven Reader. They're all available via the website bilderberg.org, along with an e-book, which is a book of my articles.